My name is Alina Paul. I'm 32 years old, a sergeant in the United States Army Special Forces. And until last night, I believed the only war my family had to fight was in the Middle East, where my husband, Kalen, is currently deployed. I was wrong. I never imagined that a dinner at my in-laws' estate in Connecticut would end with my mother-in-law, Genevieve, slapping me so hard my head hit an oak-paneled wall, and my sister-in-law, Serafina, spitting on my service uniform while their brother Tristan laughed, filming the whole humiliating ordeal. They called me a piece of uniformed trash who had trapped their golden son. They thought they had me cornered, that no one would ever believe me. They made a fatal mistake. If you want to see the blood drain from their smug faces when that dining room door bursts open and their worst nightmare walks in, let me know where you're listening from. Hit like and follow, and get ready for a story about betrayal. And the kind of justice only a soldier can deliver. The evening began with a performance worthy of an Oscar. A deadly sweetness hung in the air of the Ashworth's cavernous dining room, thick and cloying like cheap perfume. The room itself was a monument to old money and quiet hostility, with ceilings so high they seemed to swallow sound and portraits of stern-faced ancestors judging my every breath. Genevieve, my mother-in-law, played her part to perfection. She poured me a glass of expensive Chardonnay, the cold crystal sweating in my hand, her smile a carefully constructed mask that never quite reached the Arctic chill in her eyes. Every movement was deliberate, from the way her diamond bracelet caught the light to the precise, almost surgical way she sliced her filet mignon. "We just really want to understand your world, dear," she cooed, her voice smooth as silk but with the underlying tension of a tripwire. It was a classic interrogation technique disguised as familial concern. Across the acres of polished mahogany, retired General Sterling Ashworth nodded slowly, his posture as rigid as if he were still in uniform. He made a grand sweeping comment about the bravery of soldiers, but his tone was condescending, like a man at a zoo observing a fascinating but lesser species. He spoke of grit and fortitude as if they were abstract concepts, not the lived, grinding reality of my life and my husband's. I knew this wasn't a peace summit. This was an enemy reconnaissance mission. They were probing my defenses, measuring my reactions, searching for a weakness to exploit. I remained quiet, answering their veiled questions with brief, polite, "yes, sirs," and "no, ma'ams," playing the part of the docile prey. My training had taught me to read a room, to assess threats long before they materialized. The weight of the sterling silver fork felt foreign in my hand, a clumsy tool compared to the familiar balance of a weapon. What they didn't know was that I was doing the exact same thing they were, assessing their formation, their weapons, and their intent. My world, the one they claimed to want to understand, had taught me that the most dangerous battles are often the ones that begin in silence. In a room like this, words were bullets, and I was counting their ammunition. The charade finally crumbled when Serafina, Kalen's sister, let the first shot fly. She had been picking at her food, a bored, petulant expression on her face. She set her fork down with a delicate clink, a sound that cut through the oppressive quiet. She casually inspected her manicure, then looked up at me through her lashes, a slow, insolent gaze. "I just don't understand what Kalen sees in someone so rugged," she said, the word dripping with disdain. "The army must have stripped all the femininity right out of you, hasn't it?" That was the signal. The attack had begun. Genevieve immediately reinforced her daughter's position, like a well-drilled fire team. "That's precisely what worries me," she chimed in, placing a concerned hand on her chest in a gesture of flawless theatrics. "Alina, my son needs a wife who can attend society galas, who can host fundraisers, not someone who only knows how to handle a rifle." Their words hung in the air, sharp and ugly, sucking the oxygen from the room. Every part of my training, every ounce of discipline, screamed at me to maintain my composure, to not give them the emotional reaction they craved. An emotional target is an easy target. I thought of Kalen, of his face on our last video call, tired and dusted with sand but lighting up when he saw me. That thought was my armor. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to wait. Then, I met Genevieve's gaze, my voice level and calm. Kaylin fell in love with the person I am, not the version you wish I was. That single sentence was the detonator. "You insolent thing!" Genevieve shrieked. The mask of high society elegance evaporated, revealing the raw, unfiltered hatred beneath. Her face flushed a blotchy red, her lips pulled back from her teeth. She moved faster than I anticipated. Her hand flew across the table. It wasn't just a slap. It was a shove, a calculated blow meant to unbalance me. The force of it sent my chair skidding back on the marble floor, and the back of my head connected with the hard, oak-paneled wall with a sickening thud. A sharp, blinding pain shot down my spine, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation that burned 1,000 times hotter. I am a soldier. I have been trained to endure the harshest conditions imaginable, to push through pain that would break most people. But no training exercise, no Sears school simulation, can ever prepare you for a physical assault from the woman you are supposed to call mother. It was a violation of a fundamental law of nature. In the split second after the impact, I saw a flash of panic in her eyes. Not remorse for her action, but the primal fear of a predator who has just realized its attack might have been witnessed. Before the stars finished exploding behind my eyes, Serafina was there, standing over me, a vulture circling. Her face was twisted in a sneer of pure triumph. She stared down, her eyes fixated on the decorations pinned to the chest of my Army Green Service uniform. The Silver Star, for gallantry in action. The Bronze Star, for meritorious service in a combat zone. The Purple Heart, for being wounded by the enemy. Medals my husband had proudly, gently pinned on me himself, his fingers brushing against the fabric with reverence. "Garbage," she whispered, her voice laced with venom. And then she spat. The sound was obscene in the silent room. A thick glob of saliva landed squarely on the uniform, sliding down the dark olive fabric to rest on the white name tape, right over the block letters spelling Paul. It wasn't just a personal insult. It was a desecration, a sacrilege. They had defiled the uniform, the very symbol of the honor that I and thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines had bled for, fought for, and died for. An ice-cold rage, clean and pure, surged through my body. It wasn't hot and messy. It was the focused, chilling fury of a sniper acquiring a target. My breathing evened out. My heart rate steadied. The pain in my head receded to a dull throb. The world sharpened into crystal-clear focus. Across the room, Tristan, the youngest, let out a delighted, wheezing laugh, his smartphone held high, its lens a malevolent red eye capturing every single moment for his future amusement. In that instant, they ceased to be family. They became objectives, hostile targets. And they had no idea that even in the midst of chaos, a soldier is always looking for one of two things: an exit strategy or a weapon. The chaos in the dining room seemed to fade to a dull, distant roar. The throbbing at the back of my skull became a steady, rhythmic drumbeat, but the cold, clear rage held me steady. My eyes, however, were locked on the ugly, glistening stain on my uniform. It was a focal point, an anchor in the storm of the present. And as I stared at that violation, that deliberate mark of defilement on the name Paul, my mind broke away from the battlefield of the present and retreated into the archives of the past, searching for the origins of this war I hadn't known I was fighting. The memory that surfaced first was one of pure, undiluted pride. I was standing in my childhood bedroom in our small house in Ohio, the scent of my mom's long-gone pot roast still seeming to linger in the floral wallpaper. The room was the same, but I was different. I was looking at myself in the full-length mirror my dad had mounted on the back of the door, and I was seeing a stranger I had worked my entire life to become. It was the day I was issued my Army Greens for the first time. I remembered the sheer weight of the serge wool on my shoulders, the satisfying rasp of the fabric as I moved. It wasn't just clothing, it was a mantle. Every crisp crease, every gleaming brass button, every precisely placed insignia was a testament to an oath I had taken. An oath of service, of sacrifice, and of honor. My father, a retired steelworker with hands as gnarled and strong as old oak roots, stood in the doorway. He was a man of few words, his emotions forged and tempered in the blast furnaces that had defined his life. But when he saw me, his daughter, reflected in that mirror, his quiet composure shattered. His eyes, the same clear blue as my own, welled up with tears that traced clean paths through the faint smudges of grease that never quite washed away. His voice was thick with an emotion I had rarely heard from him. "You're wearing the whole country now, Alina," he'd said, his hand briefly touching the American flag patch on my sleeve as if it were a holy relic. "Don't you ever forget what that means." Now, that same uniform, a symbol of my father's tears and a nation's trust, was soiled by the casual hatred of people who had never known a single day of honest labor or a single second of sacrifice for anyone but themselves. The contrast was a physical blow, as real and as painful as the one Genevieve had just dealt me. That memory triggered another, colder one. The first time Kaylin took me to Greenwich. The Ashworth estate wasn't a home. It was a fortress of wealth, imposing and utterly devoid of warmth. Manicured lawns rolled out like a sterile green carpet, and the house itself seemed to look down on the world with aristocratic disdain. Inside, it was a museum of uncomfortable furniture and unspoken rules. Genevieve had looked me up and down, her eyes performing a clinical assessment, as if I were a strange insect she'd found crawling on her marble floors. Serafina, oozing condescension, had asked me with a saccharine smile if I knew which fork to use for the salad course. Her question was a thinly veiled insult, a way of marking me as an outsider. Later that night, in the sterile guest room that felt more like a luxury prison cell, Kaylin had apologized, his face etched with a mixture of love and frustration. "Just give them time, Allie," he'd pleaded, his voice full of a desperate hope that I now recognized as tragic. "They'll see how incredible you are, I promise." And I believed him. I, a soldier trained to identify threats and assess hostile environments, had willingly walked into the most obvious ambush of my life. I was naive. I thought my patience, my sincerity, my unwavering love for their son could somehow erode the mountain of their prejudice. I foolishly believed our love was a powerful enough force to conquer anything. I had mistaken his love for a shield, when, in their eyes, it was the very thing that made me the target. The memories kept coming, each one another piece of the map of injustice, our wedding day. It wasn't in a grand Greenwich church with 1,000 guests. It was on a humid April afternoon in a stuffy, impersonal courtroom in Fayetteville, North Carolina. The air smelled of old paper and cheap disinfectant. Our only guests were our two best friends, a fellow sergeant and his wife, who stood as our witnesses. There was no flowing white gown, no towering cake, no string quartet. There was just Kaylin and me, both in our dress uniforms, standing before a justice of the peace. We made our vows, promising to be each other's battle buddy, in good times and in bad, for the rest of our lives. It was the most honest and real moment of my life. The Ashworths refused to come. They sent a courier with an expensive cream-colored card that felt cold to the touch. The message inside was even colder. "We wish you the best with your choice." Not our son's choice. Your choice. As if Kaylin had been a passive victim of my scheming. I saw the flicker of deep hurt in Kaylin's eyes before he masked it with a smile for my sake. He had chosen me over their expectations, over their dynasty, and for that, I'd been tried and found guilty. They would never, ever forgive me for it. The torrent of memories finally brought me to just a few days ago, to the last video call with Kaylin. His face was pixelated and shadowed, the connection lagging from halfway across the world. He looked exhausted, his jaw tight with the constant stress of deployment, a fine layer of Middle Eastern dust clinging to his skin. But the moment my face appeared on his screen, his eyes lit up with a love so pure and powerful, it felt like a physical presence, reaching through the thousands of miles between us. "Are you okay? Are they behaving?" he had asked, his voice rough with fatigue but sharp with concern. He knew them. He knew what they were capable of. And I lied. I looked into the eyes of the man I loved more than life itself, and I lied to protect him. "Everything's fine, honey. I can handle them," I'd said, forcing a cheerful smile. I didn't want to add the weight of his family's war to the burden of the one he was already fighting. I, a Special Forces sergeant, a soldier trained for unconventional warfare, thought I could handle this domestic front on my own. I had catastrophically underestimated the enemy. They didn't fight with rifles or explosives. Their weapon of choice was cruelty, a quiet and patient poison, and it was a weapon that could penetrate any armor. In the quiet aftermath of that night, the cold rage that had crystallized inside me didn't dissipate. It settled deep into my bones, becoming a silent, watchful companion. The map of past injustices was now laid bare, and with that clarity came a quiet, resolute acceptance of my reality. I was on my own. The life I had with Kalen was a world away from the one the Ashworths inhabited, and in his absence, I was a lone operator on a hostile front. The memories of their systemic cruelty became the foundation for a new kind of training regimen, one designed not for a foreign battlefield, but for survival in the Cold War they had been waging against me for years. The first test of that survival came with the holidays. I remember our first Christmas season as a married couple with a particular, chilling clarity. Kalen was on his second tour in Afghanistan. The Ashworths, I learned through a glossy society magazine someone had left at the base library, were hosting a lavish week-long holiday party at their ski chalet in Aspen. The accompanying photos showed them clinking champagne glasses, draped in cashmere, surrounded by dozens of smiling, wealthy friends. There was no photo of Kalen, no mention of the son and brother serving his country overseas, and there was certainly no invitation for his wife. I spent Christmas Eve alone in our small two-bedroom apartment just off Post in Fayetteville. The air was thick with the silence of 100 other families missing someone. I ate a sad, single-serving frozen turkey dinner, the kind that comes in a black plastic tray, and watched Jimmy Stewart find his will to live again in It's a Wonderful Life. The irony was almost too much to bear. When Kalen's call finally came through, the connection crackling over a satellite phone, I pasted a bright, cheerful smile on my face. "We're having a great time," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "My friend Sarah has her whole family in town. Her mom made a huge honey-baked ham." I painted a vivid picture of a warm, bustling home I wasn't in because I couldn't bear to spoil his one moment of peace with the truth, that his family had made me invisible, that the loneliness I felt in that quiet apartment was colder and deeper than any December snow blanketing the mountains of Connecticut. Their campaign of isolation wasn't just social, it was strategic. A few months later, my old Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle that had seen more mud than pavement, finally gave up. The transmission was shot. The quote from the mechanic was a staggering number, far more than I had in my savings. Somehow, Genevieve found out. She called me, her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "Alina, darling, I heard about your car trouble," she purred. "Don't you worry your pretty little head. I'll wire you the money. Just consider it a little gift from me to you." I held the phone, my knuckles white. I knew what it was. It wasn't a gift. It was a leash. It was a chain she could use to pull me, to control me, to make me indebted to her. She wanted me to need her because needing her meant she owned a piece of me. "Thank you for the offer, Genevieve," I said, my voice polite but firm. "But I have it handled." I hung up before she could protest. That month, I picked up weekend shifts at a local dive bar just outside the base, the kind of place with sticky floors and the lingering smell of stale beer. For 4 straight weekends, I slung beers and wiped down tables, my back aching and my feet screaming in protest. I'd get home long after midnight, my hands smelling of bleach and fried food. But at the end of the month, I walked into that mechanic's shop and paid for the repairs in cash. My hands were raw and calloused, but my self-respect was intact. It was a small victory, but it was mine. In the midst of those long, cold months of quiet endurance, a package arrived. A simple, battered cardboard box with Kalen's familiar scrawl on it, covered in customs tape from an APO address. My hands trembled slightly as I sliced it open. Inside, nestled in crumpled newspaper, was a silk scarf, the most brilliant shade of cerulean blue I'd ever seen, soft and impossibly warm to the touch. Tucked inside was a handwritten letter on a creased piece of paper. Bought this in a market near the base, he wrote. The old man who sold it to me said this blue is the color of hope. I'm sending all of my hope to you, Ali. Stay warm. I wrapped the scarf around my neck, burying my face in the soft fabric. It smelled faintly of him, of dust and salt, and something uniquely Kalen. And I stood there, in the middle of my quiet kitchen, and I cried. It was the first time I had cried since he'd deployed. They weren't tears of self-pity or loneliness. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. I was crying because I was loved, fiercely, unconditionally. His love was my fortress, the one stronghold they could never breach. Instead of letting their isolation break me, I turned it into a crucible. I began to treat my life not as a waiting period, but as a training ground. Every morning before the sun rose, I would run 10 miles. The cold North Carolina air burning my lungs, pushing my body to its absolute limit so my mind had no room for despair. I spent hours at the shooting range, the precise, methodical focus on the target clearing my head of the toxic noise of the Ashworths. The sharp crack of the rifle, the recoil against my shoulder. It was a form of therapy. I read everything I could get my hands on. Books on military strategy, on psychology, on the leadership tactics of great figures who had faced down impossible odds. I wasn't just staying in shape for my next deployment. I was, without fully realizing it, forging the weapons I would need for the war that was already here, on my own soil. The Ashworths thought their silence and their exclusion would weaken me, that it would make me small and desperate. But they were wrong. Isolation doesn't just test your strength, it reveals it. And in that solitary crucible, I wasn't weakening. I was being forged into steel. Steel is forged in fire and then quenched in water. My isolation was the fire, hardening me, shaping my resolve. But a person cannot live in the fire forever. There were days when the silence in my small apartment wasn't a training ground, but a crushing weight. Days when the four walls felt like they were closing in, and the only company I had was the ghost of my husband's presence. It was on one of those days, when the quiet became too loud to bear, that I found my water. I found my quenching. It was a small, unassuming diner a few miles off base, tucked into a tired-looking strip mall. The sign, buzzing with a faulty neon light, read, "The Soldier's Mess." It was the kind of place you could easily drive by 100 times and never notice. But that day, I pulled my Jeep into the parking lot, needing nothing more than to be surrounded by the anonymous chatter of strangers. The moment I stepped inside, the warm, comforting smell of garlic, coffee, and frying bacon wrapped around me like a blanket. The place was run by a woman who seemed to be a permanent fixture behind the counter. She was in her 60s, with a cloud of dark hair fighting its way out of a bun and hands perpetually dusted with flour. Her name was Maria. Her smile was as warm and genuine as the steam rising from the coffee pots, and it reached all the way to her kind, knowing eyes. She didn't know me from anyone, but the first time I walked in, wearing my fatigues, she took one look at my face and seemed to understand everything. She simply wiped her hands on her apron, pointed to a worn-out booth in the corner, and said in a voice that was both gravelly and melodic, "You look tired, honey. Sit. I'll make you some lasagna." I didn't have the energy to argue. I just slid into the booth and sat there in silence as she brought me a heaping plate of the best lasagna I had ever tasted, rich with cheese and a sauce that tasted like it had been simmering for generations. I ate slowly, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than loneliness or anger. For the first time, I felt like I was home. That diner became my safe house, my forward operating base in the war of attrition against my own solitude. Maria never once asked me about my in-laws. She never pried into my life or Kalen's deployment. But she knew. A woman whose own husband, a command sergeant major, had been killed by a roadside bomb in Iraq. She had a sixth sense for the invisible wounds soldiers and their families carry. Sometimes I'd just sit at the counter, nursing a cup of black coffee, and she'd work in comfortable silence, only pausing to place a plate with a warm cannoli in front of me. Sometimes, she said to me one afternoon, her back to me as she kneaded a mountain of dough, "The toughest fight isn't over there. It's right here." She tapped her chest with a floured hand. "But you're a fighter, Bambina. I can see it in your eyes. That simple validation, that quiet acknowledgement from a near stranger, meant more to me than any hollow compliment General Sterling had ever uttered. She didn't see the gold-digging trash that Genevieve saw. She didn't see a socially inept soldier. She saw a warrior. She saw me. My second ally appeared in the one place I went to exercise my demons, the base gym. He was a retired master sergeant named Frank, a mountain of a man who had lost his left leg below the knee to an IED in Afghanistan. He moved with a slight, rhythmic gait on his high-tech prosthetic, and he became my unofficial and very reluctant training partner. Frank never offered me a shred of pity. Pity was a weakness he had no time for. Instead, he offered me a challenge. He'd see me on the bench press and bark, "That's all you got, Paul. The enemy ain't gonna wait for you to take a water break." He pushed me, insulted me, and competed with me. We'd share war stories between sets, the funny ones, the stupid ones, and sometimes the ones that still hurt. We communicated in the rough, unfiltered language of soldiers, a bond forged in shared sacrifice and gallows humor. Maria and Frank, the Italian-American Gold Star wife who fed my soul, and the gruff disabled veteran who sharpened my spirit. They became my family. Not a family of bloodlines and bank accounts, but one built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared scars. They were the family I chose, the family that chose me. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Frank tossed a book into my lap. "The wife is making me read this stuff. You should probably read it too," he grumbled, trying to sound annoyed, but I saw the flicker of concern in his eyes. The book was Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. That night, I didn't sleep. I read. I devoured every word. I saw myself on every page, the stoicism, the refusal to show weakness, the armor I had so carefully constructed around my heart. I realized that my silence, my determination to handle everything on my own, wasn't just strength. It was also a form of fear. Fear of being a burden. Fear of being seen as weak. Brené Brown wrote, "Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome." The words hit me like a physical force. They gave me permission to feel something other than rage or resolve. They gave me permission to be human. It makes me think about all the Mariahs and Franks out there in the world. The people who step in and become the family we need, right when we need them the most. If you have someone like that in your life, someone who saw you when you felt invisible, I want you to hit that like button right now in their honor. And in the comments below, just write the name of your chosen family member. Let's fill this space with their names. That night, for the first time, I took out a piece of paper and a pen. I wrote a long, long letter to Kalen. I told him everything. The Christmas in Aspen, the broken-down Jeep, the constant subtle cruelties. I wrote until my hand cramped and the paper was stained with tears I didn't even know I had left to cry. I folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, but I didn't send it. I didn't need to. The act of writing it, of finally allowing myself to be vulnerable on the page, had already set me free. It was my own declaration of courage, my first step in daring greatly. The fragile peace I had built in my small corner of North Carolina, the warmth found at Maria's counter, and the strength forged in the gym with Frank, was shattered by the shrill, unwelcome ring of my phone. I saw the name flash on the screen, Genevieve Ashworth, and a cold dread washed over me. For a foolish, fleeting second, a tiny, naive part of me wondered if this was it. The apology. The olive branch. The part of my heart that still believed in family dared to hope. I was wrong. "Alina, darling," her voice slithered through the phone, coated in a layer of sweetness so thick it was alarming. It was the voice she used when maneuvering pieces on a chessboard. "I was just thinking of you. It must be so terribly lonely down there all by yourself. The family is having a small get-together this weekend at the yacht club. We'd all just love for you to be there. We really want to make things right." Every instinct, honed by years of military training, screamed at me. Ambush, danger, trap. This wasn't an olive branch. It was bait. But then Brené Brown's words echoed in my mind. The courage to show up and be seen. I had been hiding, surviving in my self-imposed exile. But courage wasn't about avoiding the fight, it was about choosing your terms of engagement. My terms had changed. I would no longer show up hoping for acceptance. This time, I would show up on a reconnaissance mission. I would gather intelligence. That's very thoughtful of you, Genevieve, I replied, my voice perfectly level and controlled. I'd be happy to come. When I told Maria, she was wiping down the counter at the diner. She stopped, rag mid-air, her warm eyes filled with a deep, maternal worry. She reached across and squeezed my hand. Be careful, Bambina, she whispered, her voice low and serious. A wolf never changes its fur. It only learns to wear better sheep's clothing. The Greenwich Yacht Club was the physical embodiment of Ashworth arrogance, a sprawling temple of old money perched on the Long Island Sound. Gleaming white sailboats bobbed in the marina. The members, uniformly dressed in crisp white and navy blue linen, drifted across manicured lawns, speaking in that distinct, nasal tone of the New England elite, a sound that always set my teeth on edge. The Ashworths greeted me with air kisses that never made contact and smiles as brilliant and fake as cubic zirconia. As they led me through the crowd, I felt the ripple of judgment follow me. I was a foreign object in their pristine world. My simple navy blue dress and military posture scanned by 100 pairs of eyes. The whispers were a persistent swarm. Is that Kaylin's soldier wife? She looks so out of place. Genevieve must be mortified. This wasn't a family gathering. It was a public tribunal, a carefully orchestrated parade of shame designed to reinforce my status as an outsider. But I wasn't the same woman who had first walked into their home. I held my head high, met their condescending stares with a cool neutrality, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse than a few judgmental socialites. After an hour of this suffocating performance, General Sterling guided me to a secluded corner of the veranda. He offered me a glass of scotch, which I politely declined. Alina, he began, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble, his man-to-man tone. Genevieve and I have been talking. We think it's time for Kaylin to consider his future. There's a senior executive position waiting for him at Ashworth Holdings. A real career, not this adventurism. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. And, of course, as his wife, you would be well taken care of. A permanent seat on the board of the Ashworth Family Trust. He said it so casually, as if my husband's entire life and career were just another asset to be managed. We're prepared to let bygones be bygones, he continued, his eyes glinting with the cold certainty of a man who believed everything had a price. If you can be sensible and persuade Kaylin to make the right decision for the family. There it was, the poison pill wrapped in gold foil. It wasn't an offer, it was a bribe. A blatant, insulting attempt to use their fortune to strip my husband of the one thing he valued more than anything: his service, his honor, his identity as a soldier. They wanted to buy him, and they thought I was the broker. A cold, clean anger rose in my chest. My husband's honor is not for sale, General, I said, my voice quiet but as hard as steel. The mask of affability dropped from his face, replaced by a flash of raw fury. His jaw tightened. Just as he was about to speak, Tristan materialized at his side, all smarmy smiles. He held up his smartphone, angling it like a selfie, but his thumb was hovering over the record button. I saw the small red light flash. Wow, that's so ungrateful, Alina, Tristan said, his voice just loud enough for the nearby cluster of Sterling's friends to hear. My family is extending an olive branch, and you just slap it away. In that instant, the entire operation became crystal clear. The sweet phone call, the public gathering, the poisonous offer. It was a coordinated attack. They were baiting me into an emotional outburst that Tristan could capture on video, to be edited and twisted into a narrative of the unstable, aggressive, working-class shrew who couldn't appreciate their generosity. I looked from Tristan's smug face to Sterling's simmering rage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give them the satisfaction. I simply held their gaze. I see, I said, my voice calm and analytical. This is a psychological operation, a very amateur one. I turned my back on them, on their stunned, furious faces, and walked away. I left them standing on the veranda, their plan in ruins, their bait untaken. The battle was far from over, but I had just won a decisive skirmish, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that their failure would only make them more desperate. After the fiasco at the yacht club, a quiet, determined fire began to burn inside me. I channeled that energy, that cold fury, into something meaningful. For months, Maria, Frank, and I had poured every spare moment of our lives into organizing a small charity auction. Our mission was simple but sacred: to raise funds for the Gold Star Families Organization, a nonprofit that provides support for the families of service members who have died in the line of duty. This event was more than just a project for me. It was personal. It was a tribute. We were dedicating the auction to the memory of Sergeant David "Davy" Jones, Kaylin's best friend, his brother-in-arms, who had been killed in action 2 years ago. Davy had been the best man at our courthouse wedding. He was the one who promised me he'd always have Kaylin's back. He kept that promise until his very last breath. For me, this event was hallowed ground. It was a small pocket of the world where honor and sacrifice were the only currencies that mattered. The back room of Maria's diner became our headquarters. It was filled with donated items, a signed football from the local high school coach, a handmade quilt from a group of Army wives, a gift certificate for a weekend of fishing from a retired Marine. It was a collection of heartfelt offerings, a testament to a community's respect for its fallen. This wasn't about glamour or prestige. It was about remembrance. It was about taking care of our own. Then, 2 days before the event, the serpent slithered back into my sanctuary. An email appeared in my inbox. The sender was Genevieve's personal assistant. The subject line read, "A generous partnership." My heart sank before I even opened it. The email was sickeningly cheerful and written in cold, corporate language. "Mrs. Ashworth is thrilled to announce her intention to become the primary sponsor for your lovely event," it began. She has already arranged for the Ashworth Holdings corporate logo to be prominently displayed on the main stage banner and in all event materials. A public relations team will also be on site to document the family's generous contribution for media distribution. I had to read it 3 times. My vision blurred. The words swam on the screen, but their meaning was brutally clear. They weren't offering to help. They were staging a hostile takeover. They wanted to plaster their tainted corporate logo over Davy's memory. They intended to use the profound grief of military families as a backdrop for a PR stunt, a cheap photo op to whitewash their public image. They were trying to buy their way into a world of honor they could never understand, and in doing so, they were desecrating it. They wanted to spit on something else I held sacred. That was it. The last line had been crossed. The carefully constructed dam of my restraint, which had held back years of slights, insults, and cruelty, finally broke. I didn't call. I didn't text. I got in my Jeep and drove. The 2-hour drive to Greenwich was a blur. I didn't hear the music on the radio. I didn't see the fall foliage of the Connecticut countryside. All I saw was red. A cold, focused, tactical rage settled over me. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a desecration. And they had just declared war on the memory of my friends. I didn't bother knocking. I pushed the heavy oak door to the Ashworth mansion open and walked straight in. The family was assembled in the cavernous living room, sipping afternoon cocktails, laughing at some vapid joke. They looked up, their smiles freezing on their faces as they saw me. I must have looked like the angel of death. "Get out of my event," I said. My voice was low, devoid of all emotion. It was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Genevieve was the first to recover. She let out a condescending little laugh, a tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "Don't be so naive, Alina. We're helping you. The Ashworth name brings prestige. It will help you raise far more money than you ever could on your own." "I don't want your dirty money," I snarled, the sound ripping from my throat. "This isn't a business transaction. This is about honor." Serafina, lounging on a silk chaise, scoffed. She looked me up and down with pure contempt. "Honor?" she sneered. "What would the daughter of a steelworker know about honor?" And that was the final word. the one that ignited the gasoline. Every ounce of control, every bit of the disciplined soldier I'd trained myself to be, vanished. All that was left was raw, unfiltered fury. Honor! The word exploded from my lungs, a roar that silenced the room, making the crystal on the bar tremble. I took a step forward, my eyes locked on Genevieve. You want me to tell you about honor? I'll tell you about honor. Honor is Sergeant Davy Jones using his own body to shield my husband from gunfire and taking the bullet that was meant for him. Honor is my father working 3 shifts in a steel mill with blistered hands so that I could have a chance to go to college. Honor is the flag they drape over a coffin and the tears of a mother who will never see her son again. Honor is everything you will never be, and it is the one thing your money can never, ever buy. My voice was shaking, but not from weakness. It was shaking with the force of every injustice, every insult, every moment of condescension I had ever endured from them. I pointed a trembling finger straight at Genevieve's shocked, pale face. You have made a fatal mistake, I said, my voice dropping back to a lethal whisper. You have stepped onto my battlefield, and I swear to you, from this moment on, my silence is over. The war has begun. I turned on my heel, my back straight, leaving them frozen in a stunned tableau of their own making. As I walked out that door, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't just going to protect myself anymore. I was going to dismantle them. There are some things in life that are sacred. Family, love, and for many of us, the honor of those who serve and sacrifice. They crossed a line that should never have been crossed. If you believe in defending that kind of honor, hit the like button for every soldier like Davy Jones. And in the comments, I just want you to write one single word that the Ashworths will never understand. Honor. I knew they had underestimated me before, but now they had no idea of the enemy they had just created. The drive back to Fayetteville from Greenwich was a silent, 2-hour blur of highway lights and simmering focus. The explosive rage that had erupted in the Ashworths' living room had cooled, crystallizing into something far more dangerous. Cold, clear, tactical certainty. My emotions had been a liability. Now they were fuel. The war had been declared. So what was my first move? In every military operation, the first step is to secure your base and assemble your assets. My apartment, paid for by a trust controlled by the Ashworths, was compromised territory. So I didn't go home. I went to the one place I knew was safe. I walked into Maria's diner just before she closed up for the night. Frank was sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of black coffee. They both looked up as I entered, and the question was in their eyes. They didn't need to ask. They saw it on my face. I need a secure operating base, I said, my voice flat, professional. It was the same tone I would use to brief a mission. And I need my team. Maria didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, untied her flour-dusted apron, and hung it on a hook. The diner is yours, she said. Whatever you need. Frank pushed his coffee cup aside and gave me a grim, determined look. Just give us our orders, Sergeant. With my command center established, it was time to call in my specialists. I didn't call a lawyer first. That was a conventional weapon for a conventional fight. This was something else. I pulled out my phone and made the most important call of the night. It rang twice before a familiar, slightly nerdy voice answered. Talk to me, he said. Hey, wizard, I replied, a small smile touching my lips for the first time that day. It's Ali. I need you to do some of your magic for me. Wizard, Sergeant Marcus Thorne, was a legend in the signal intelligence community. We had served together on a deployment years ago. He was the guy who could pull a ghost out of a machine. I gave him a brief, unembellished summary of the situation. He didn't ask for details. He didn't question my motives. The only thing he asked was, "Are you safe?" "I am," I confirmed. "Good. Send me the IP address for their main network. Consider it done, Ali." He hung up. That was the beauty of the Brotherhood of Soldiers. Loyalty is the default setting. It doesn't need to be earned twice. A few hours later, as the three of us sat in the small, cluttered back office of the diner, surrounded by boxes of pasta and canned tomatoes, my laptop pinged. An encrypted link from Wizard. I clicked it, entered the password he'd sent, and began the download. It was a massive file. Terabytes of data. "What is it?" Maria asked, peering over my shoulder. "The ammunition," I replied. It was everything. Footage from every security camera inside and outside the Ashworth mansion, going back 6 months. For the next several hours, Frank and I sat in silence. The only sound the hum of the old refrigerator and the click of the mouse as I navigated through the video files. Maria kept us supplied with fresh coffee. It was worse than I could have imagined. We watched a highlight reel of their contempt. We saw Genevieve on the phone with one of her friends, mocking my Ohio accent. We saw Serafina finding the small, thoughtful Christmas gift I had left for her. A first edition of her favorite book I'd hunted down in an old bookstore, and tossing it directly into a trash can with a look of disgust. We saw General Sterling, on the veranda with a colleague, referring to his son's marriage as a temporary embarrassment. And then, we found the footage from that night. The night of the ambush. It was all there, captured in high definition from 3 different angles. The slap, the spit hitting my uniform, Tristan's gleeful laugh, the cold, cruel words, the conspiracy. Frank, a man who had seen the worst of humanity on the battlefield, let out a slow, heavy breath. He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Jesus, kid," he whispered, his voice thick with disgust. "This isn't a family. It's a goddamn crime syndicate." Seeing the raw, undeniable proof was like pouring salt on a wound, but it was also clarifying. It burned away any lingering doubt, any shred of sentimentality. It solidified my resolve into something unbreakable. I took a large sheet of butcher paper from a roll Maria used for table coverings and spread it across the table. In the center, I wrote the mission objective: target, justice, and boundaries. From that central point, I began to map out my war. My plan would advance on 3 fronts. The first was legal. I needed a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. I needed someone who specialized in domestic abuse and harassment cases, and preferably, a veteran. Someone who understood the language of honor and wouldn't be intimidated by the Ashworth name or their high-priced legal team. The second front was information warfare. My strategy here was simple. Go dark. Maintain absolute silence and let them make the first move. They had Tristan's edited video. They thought it was their ace in the hole. My unedited, multi-angle footage wasn't just a weapon, it was a tactical nuke, to be deployed only when it would cause maximum strategic damage. Sun Tzu's words, which I'd scribbled on a sticky note and stuck to my bathroom mirror years ago, came to mind. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. The third and most critical front was personal. I had to inform Kalen. He deserved to hear the unvarnished truth directly from me, not through the twisted lies of his family. I knew a phone call was too risky and too emotional. He was in a hostile environment. He needed to be focused on his mission, not on a war back home. So, I opened my encrypted email client and composed a message to his secure address. I wrote it like a situation report, concise, factual, and to the point. I told him the situation on the home front had escalated, that hostile actions were taken by his family, and that I had secured evidence and was proceeding with countermeasures. I assured him my personal security was guaranteed and told him to remain focused on his mission. I ended it with, "I love you, over and out." I hit send. There was no part of me that worried he wouldn't understand. We were more than husband and wife, we were teammates. He would trust my judgment. He would trust that I had the situation under control. This was my fight to start, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that he would be there to help me finish it. The Ashworths, cornered and panicked, made a classic tactical error. They underestimated their enemy. My silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline. It was the calm before the storm. And they, in their arrogance, walked right into it. 2 days after my visit, my lawyer, a retired Marine colonel named Jackson, who had the calm, predatory stillness of a sniper, forwarded me an email he'd received. The Ashworths were calling a press conference at the Manhattan office of their high-powered law firm. Wizard, my friend from Signal Intelligence, had already worked his magic. He sent me an encrypted file containing the press conference's guest list and talking points. It was exactly as I'd predicted. They had invited a handful of sympathetic journalists and were preparing to paint me as an unstable, gold-digging aggressor. The centerpiece of their presentation would be Tristan's carefully edited video, designed to show me as the unhinged villain. Wizard sent a follow-up message. "They're planning a public execution, Allie. Be careful." I typed back a short reply. "They're not preparing for my execution, Wiz. They're setting my stage." On the day of the press conference, Colonel Jackson and I arrived at the sleek, soulless skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. We didn't go inside. We waited in the black town car parked across the street, watching the curated list of reporters file into the building. From my vantage point, I could see the conference room through the large plate glass windows, a stage, a podium, and a large screen behind it. My battlefield. "Are you ready for this, Sergeant?" Jackson asked, his voice a low rumble. He hadn't flinched once when I showed him the unedited videos. He'd simply nodded and said, "Good. Now we have them." "Yes, sir," I said, my heart beating a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. "The operation is a go." We watched as the Ashworth clan took their places. Genevieve, dressed in morning black Chanel, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. General Sterling stood stiffly beside her, the very picture of a patriarch wronged. Tristan and Serafina hovered behind them, their faces arranged into masks of somber concern. It was a masterful performance. Genevieve stepped up to the podium. Her voice, trembling with practiced sorrow, filled the room. "It is with the heaviest of hearts that we are forced to address these unfortunate family matters publicly," she began, her voice catching. "We have always tried to welcome our son's wife, but her recent instability has created a situation that is both painful and dangerous." That was our cue. Jackson gave a slight nod to our driver. We got out of the car. We didn't rush. We walked with deliberate purpose across the street and into the lobby. As we rode the elevator up, I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. Not the hot, messy adrenaline of a firefight, but the cold, clean surge of a plan perfectly executed. Just as Genevieve was saying, we have video evidence of her unprovoked aggression, which we are now prepared to show you. The heavy doors to the conference room burst open. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. A collective gasp went through the reporters. The clicking of cameras stopped. For a moment, there was absolute, deafening silence. Standing in the doorway, ramrod straight, was Captain Kalen Vance. He was in his full Army service uniform, the deep blue coat, the light blue trousers, the white shirt, and black tie. The polished brass on his belt buckle gleamed under the conference room lights. The medals on his chest, the bronze star, the purple heart, were a silent testament to a world of honor the people in this room knew nothing about. He had taken a special military transport flight and had landed just a few hours ago. He was supposed to be thousands of miles away. The color drained from the faces of the Ashworths. It was a spectacular sight. Genevieve's jaw dropped, her carefully constructed mask of sorrow shattering into a million pieces. Serafina's eyes went wide with sheer terror. Tristan physically recoiled, stumbling back a step as if he'd been struck. General Sterling's face, usually a mask of stoic authority, turned a pasty, sickly white. Their worst nightmare, in full-dress uniform, had just walked through the door. Kalen's eyes scanned the room, cold and hard as granite, before they landed on his family. He walked forward, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. He didn't look at me. Not yet. His focus was entirely on the enemy. "Mother," he said, and his voice cut through the air like a razor. It was quiet, yet it carried an authority that filled the entire room. "I believe you've omitted a few key details from your story." He walked directly to the podium and stood beside his trembling mother. He turned to face the stunned reporters. His gaze was unflinching. "My name is Captain Kalen Vance. I came home a little earlier than expected," he said, his voice ringing with command. "I was standing outside the dining room door on the night in question I heard you planning to destroy my wife's reputation. I heard you, Tristan, bragging about how you would edit the video to make her look like the aggressor. Every word was a hammer blow, driving another nail into the coffin of their lies. He's lying, Genevieve shrieked, her voice shrill. He's suffering from PTSD. He doesn't know what he's saying. General Sterling found his voice and bellowed, "My son is unwell. This is a private matter." The reporters erupted into a frenzy of questions. Kalen held up a hand and the room fell silent again. He looked at his father, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by icy resolve. "Perhaps," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm level, "we should review the complete, unedited events of that evening, just to clear things up." He gave a slight nod in our direction. That was Jackson's cue. The colonel, moving with an old soldier's economy of motion, strode to the front of the room, pulled a small USB drive from his pocket, and plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector. The massive screen behind the Ashworths, which had been displaying the logo of their law firm, flickered and then came to life. It was the security camera footage, uncut, unedited, from 3 different angles. The entire room held its breath. They watched the slap. They saw Serafina's sneer as she leaned in. They witnessed the disgusting act of her spitting on my uniform. They heard every cruel, calculated word, every threat, every shriek of hatred. The clicking of the cameras started again, this time a furious, non-stop fusillade, like machine gun fire. The reporters' faces were a mixture of shock and predatory glee. They knew this was the story of a lifetime. Genevieve made a small choking sound and crumpled into her chair, her face in her hands. Serafina covered her face, turning away from the screen as if she could hide from her own vile actions. Tristan, the brave little filmmaker, looked like a cornered rat, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The video ended. Kalen walked away from the podium. He walked directly to me. He ignored the reporters, ignored his shattered family. He took my hand, his grip firm and steady. Then he turned to face the podium one last time, his voice ringing out clear and true for everyone to hear. "She is my family," he declared, his eyes locking with his father's. "And you just declared war on both of us." Victory isn't a single, explosive moment. It's a shockwave. What happened in that Manhattan conference room wasn't the end of the war. It was the detonation. In the days that followed, Kalen and I found ourselves at the epicenter of the fallout. The story exploded. It wasn't just the mainstream news, which delighted in the takedown of a powerful, old money family. It was our world that reacted with the most force. Task and Purpose and the Military Times, respected publications read by everyone in uniform, ran the story with blistering headlines: "The Disgrace in Greenwich," "Ashworth Patriarch Humiliates Green Beret Daughter-in-Law." The unedited video was everywhere. The military community, a fiercely protective tribe, was outraged. The story of a decorated soldier being spat on by the wealthy elite was the kind of story that ignited a firestorm. The consequences for the Ashworths were swift and brutal. We didn't have to lift another finger. The machine of public opinion, once set in motion, did the work for us. General Sterling was forced to resign from the boards of 3 different defense contractors. Ashworth Holdings faced calls for boycotts. The family retreated behind the high walls of their Greenwich fortress, but the damage was done. Their name, once a symbol of power, was now synonymous with disgrace. Kalen and I chose silence. We declined every interview request, letting the truth of that video speak for itself. But public victory is different from private peace. The night after the press conference, back in our small apartment near Fort Bragg, the adrenaline finally faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with everything that didn't need to be said. Kalen didn't let me go. He just held me, his arms wrapped around me as we sat on our worn-out couch. I could feel a slight, almost imperceptible tremor running through his body. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was grief. That was his family, his blood. And he had just witnessed its complete moral decay, had been forced to be the one to expose it to the world. A son should never have to do that. "I'm sorry, Allie," he whispered into my hair, his voice thick. "I'm so sorry I didn't protect you from them sooner." I leaned back and looked at him, at the deep sadness in his eyes. "You were there when it mattered most," I said softly. "You came home. You chose the right side, teammate." He managed a small, pained smile. "Always," he said. That was all we needed. In that moment, the noise of the outside world faded away, and it was just us. Two soldiers in the quiet aftermath of a battle won, beginning the long process of counting the costs. A week later, a crisp cream-colored envelope arrived via messenger from Colonel Jackson's office. It was from Genevieve, drafted by her legal team. It was a masterclass in corporate non-apology, filled with hollow, legal-approved phrases like "deepest regrets for the unfortunate series of events" and "a sincere hope for familial reconciliation." There wasn't an ounce of genuine remorse in it. It was the letter of a CEO addressing a PR crisis, not a mother speaking to her son and his wife. That evening, Kaylin and I took the letter out to the small, patchy backyard of our apartment building. We stood by the rusty communal grill, the last rays of the North Carolina sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. We read it one last time, the empty words feeling like ash in our mouths even before they were burned. Kaylin took out his Zippo lighter, the same one he'd carried on 3 deployments. With a flick of his thumb, a small, steady flame appeared. He held it to the corner of the expensive paper. We watched as the fire caught, curling the edges, turning the carefully crafted lies black. The flames consumed deepest regrets and devoured hope for reconciliation until there was nothing left but a fragile, glowing skeleton of ash. "There's no going back," Kaylin said, his voice quiet but resolute. The last of the embers floated up into the twilight and disappeared. "We build our own family, Ali, starting now." He was right. The final step was to make that separation official, to turn our emotional boundary into a legal fortress. Colonel Jackson drafted the settlement agreement. The terms were non-negotiable. The Ashworths were to issue a formal public apology drafted by us. They were to make a substantial 7-figure donation to the Gold Star family's charity we had organized the fundraiser for. And the most important term, a permanent, legally binding, no-contact order. Any attempt to contact us, directly or indirectly, would be considered harassment and would trigger severe legal penalties. They signed it without a fight. They had no other choice. We had established a demilitarized zone around our lives, a line they could never cross again. In the quiet days that followed, I thought a lot about forgiveness. There's a passage in the Bible, in Matthew, about forgiving someone 70 times, 7 times. I used to think that meant you always had to let the person back into your life. I don't believe that anymore. I forgave them. Not because they deserved it. Not because they asked for it. I forgave them because I deserved peace. Holding on to that much hatred is like carrying a rucksack full of stones on a 20-mile march. It only weighs you down. My forgiveness was me letting go of the weight of my hatred, not me opening the door for them to come back in. Some doors need to stay closed. They need to be locked, bolted, and barricaded, not for their sake, but for yours. The ashes from that letter, and from our old life, settled 6 months later in the rich, dark soil of Virginia. We left North Carolina behind. Using the settlement money and our savings, we bought a small plot of land nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Our new home was a log cabin, solid and unassuming, with a wide porch that overlooked a sprawling valley. There was no Greenwich luxury, no cold marble or pretentious art. There was only the quiet majesty of ancient mountains and a sky so full of stars it took your breath away. This was our new forward operating base, our sanctuary. Here, we made the rules. Every morning, we'd sit on that porch with steaming mugs of coffee, watching the mist burn off the valley below, breathing in air that smelled of pine and damp earth. It was a kind of peace I'd never known, a quiet so profound it felt like it could heal wounds you didn't even know you had. The ghosts of the Ashworths couldn't reach us here. Their world of poisonous whispers and calculated cruelty simply couldn't exist in a place like this. Kaylin, true to his word, continued to serve, but in a new capacity. He took a position as a lead instructor at a nearby training academy, shaping the next generation of soldiers. His war was over. His new mission was to pass on his wisdom. And I, after many long nights spent staring at that starry sky, found my new mission too. I started a nonprofit organization, a small project that grew from the deepest parts of my own scars. I called it the Vanguard Project. We run intensive survival and resilience retreats exclusively for female service members. On our land, in the heart of these mountains, I teach them the skills that saved me. I teach them how to navigate by the stars when all their equipment has failed. I teach them how to build a fire in the pouring rain when they're cold and exhausted. And most importantly, I teach them how to identify and counter an enemy who doesn't wear a uniform, the kind that smiles at you across a dinner table while planning your destruction. I took my own personal battlefield and turned it into a training ground for others. I took my scars and made them into a map. Life settled into a beautiful, predictable rhythm. The changing of the seasons, the hard work of maintaining the land, the quiet joy of building a life together from the ground up. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, everything changed again. Kalen was outside, the rhythmic thwack of his axe splitting firewood echoing through the cool air. I watched him from the porch for a moment, the strong, steady man who was my anchor. I took a deep breath and stepped outside. "Captain," I said, my voice even and formal, just a hint of a smile playing on my lips. "I have a situation report for you." He stopped, sinking the axe into the chopping block. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm and turned to me, a quizzical look on his face. "Go ahead, Sergeant, report." I walked over to him, took his calloused, wood-scented hand, and placed it flat against my stomach. I looked him right in the eye. "We have a new recruit joining the team," I whispered. "ETA is approximately 7 months." He froze. His entire body went still. The playful smile on his face dissolved, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His eyes, the same clear blue eyes that had seen so much conflict, widened. He looked down at my stomach, then back up at my face, searching for confirmation. I just nodded, a tear escaping and tracing a path down my cheek. And then, Captain Kalen Vance, the hardened Green Beret who had faced down enemies in the mountains of Afghanistan, did something I had never seen him do before. He dropped to his knees in the dirt and the wood chips. He gently pressed his ear against my stomach, his big shoulders starting to shake. He began to cry, not quiet, dignified tears, but deep, racking sobs of pure, unadulterated joy. Sobs of healing. Sobs for a future we had fought so hard to claim for ourselves. Later that evening, as we sat on the porch watching a fiery sunset bleed across the mountain peaks, I leaned my head on his shoulder. We knew what our next mission was. We would raise this child under a new set of rules. The Vance Protocol. Rule number 1. Loyalty is paramount. You stand by your team, always. Rule number 2. Honor isn't something you have, it's something you do. It's in your actions, not your name. Rule number 3. Family are the people who fight alongside you, not just the ones who share your blood. The war with the Ashworths was brutal. It cost us dearly. But in the end, it gave us the most precious gift of all: freedom. The freedom to define our own family. The freedom to live by our own code. And the freedom to know that when two soldiers stand together, they can face anything the world throws at them. In the Army, we have a saying: embrace the suck. It means to accept the misery of a situation and push through it. But I've learned a greater lesson. Don't just embrace it. Use it as fuel. Let it forge you into something stronger. And then, when the time is right, build your own damn sunrise. And that, more than any victory on any battlefield, is what true winning feels like. My story, the one defined by the Ashworths, is over. But the one Kalen and I are writing now has just begun. The Vance Protocol guides our family, but its most important lesson is that you have the power to write your own rules for life. My journey is proof that you can break free from the protocols others force upon you and create your own. For more stories about resilience and forging your own path, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I want to leave you with one question. In the comments below, tell me, what is rule number 1 in your protocol for life?